Everyone, welcome back to our podcast. This is Gloria.
I'm Olivia.
I'm Rikki.
I'm Ashley.
Alrighty, so I think we can all agree that Dr. Joseph Graves has done an amazing job being not only being a biologist, but also has been combating racism in the field. Would any of y'all like to share on how something that he has mentioned or an article that you have read recently that has been impactful to you and how he has combated racism?
I can start with what the article that I read. So for the one that I read, it was called "Why the Non-Existence of Biological Races Does Not Mean the Non-Existence of Racism." And so in this article, Graves mainly talks about like the two main different definitions of race. And because some people argue that it's more about the social aspects of race, and then the other ones talk about more about like the biological components of it. And so basically in the article, he really wants people to acknowledge how racism is caused by cultural factors within society as opposed to biological features that people may have. And so some of the cultural factors that he sort of references, he references more historical types. So he talks a bit about the history of he kind of talks about the history of like slavery and like how African Americans were treated in the past to sort of show the more cultural components. And another main thing that he mentions is that there's no direct relationship between biological and socially defined races, since it's sort of due to aversive racism that allows people to combine information about human genetic variation and how it's classified with the non-existence of racism. And so he also sort of mentions how the well-being of an individual and their overall evolutionary fitness can be negatively impacted as a result of being in a socially defined race.
Thank you for sharing. And I know a very similar article to that was Rikki's. Rikki's, can you explain how racism kind of developed into social constructs?
Yeah, the article I read recently by Dr. Graves was "Racism, Not Race: Answers to Frequently Asked Questions," and it had a lot of similar themes as the previous article that we were talking about. So he begins this article by introducing two scenarios of two different patients, and then they were both categorized by their appearance or their socially defined race. And due to that faulty categorization, the medical professionals assumed that these patients couldn't have certain diseases due to their faulty categorization. So essentially, he started with that example to kind of dive into the idea of the social construct. And this whole theory is an idea that the world is socially constructed and that social constructs make up our reality. So even though race is not necessarily defined by biology, it can be a dividing factor that has biological consequences. So in the article, Dr. Graves kind of talked about how social constructs are, even though they're not based in biology, they can have a lot of different barriers for segregated groups that can lead to barriers to education, healthcare, employment, and just living safely in general.
Okay, I know going on the other hand, it talks a little bit more on the genetics of it and kind of a little bit more on the biology side. Ashley, can you share a little bit on what that means and what Dr. Graves has mentioned in his article?
Yeah. So I read the article called "Race and the Genetic Evolution" by Joseph Graves, and he discusses the lack of racial diversity that can be found within the studies of foundational structures of population genetics based on a person's biological race. it was seen that if a person's genetic race were to be determined, it would allow researchers to find predominant cases that belong to different diseases and genetic codes. But because of that lack of research that has been done, racial specificity has been seen as unimportant within the medical community. However, Graves in this article discusses how impactful identifying those genetic markers within different biological races other than a conformed one can help find those corresponding genes and create medicine or treatments that help different racial groups rather than having a one medicine for one person kind of thing.
Thank you for sharing, Ashley. And I think this is an important title because it kind of summarizes the entirety of the paper and basically means that one lie can kind of lead and multiply into others. And what I mean by this is that Dr. Graves, in this article, he falsifies claims made by other biologists suggesting that racial and genetic differences lead to difference in intelligence. So this immediately they basically use biology to segregate intelligence between white and African American. But specifically in this article, Graves uses Rushton's theory to falsify most of these claims because it kind of stems from this. And in his theory, he suggests that difference in race is due to natural selection and reproductive strategies. And then Rushton supports his ideas by using the RK selection to justify his reasoning. But this tool is misused because he uses life history traits on race, which is inaccurate. And to further add, Dr. Graves mentions that none of these traits were even tested. So he's putting out false information to the public and making breeders and other scientists believe that the white race is superior due to higher genetic intelligence on these characteristics. And some of these characteristics of these of the R and K include the reproduction, also if it is like slow maturation, long life, stuff like that. So and it shows that it's inaccurate. And I think the idea of this is that the ideas that were made were not correct and were on the basis of racism and not science, and then which gets spread into more and more lies, and then other biologists will look at this and continue to make false information, but it's not on the basis of science. I think that's important to note when I was reading this article, and I found that that was very important. And yeah, and I think that is something that we all have in common with our papers is that Dr. Graves tries to show different ways on how different ways that racism is applied in the field of biology, either genetically or through like socially. So do any of you all have anything else to add that you thought that was important?
Like you said, it was really interesting to see how all of our papers were similar in a way that it talked about biological races, but also differed. Like for another example was from my article. It also talked about, or Graves also talked about how biological races kind of go hand in hand with geography, which it sounded really interesting to me because he sort of talks about how like geographically distant populations sort of and geographic barriers were sort of contributing to like the whole ideal that biological races does not like the non-existence of biological races does not mean the non-existence of racism. And another cool thing that he incorporated in the article was how he talked about population subdivision, which is like essentially the genetic variation of subpopulations within a species and how it sort of coincides with like the identification of geographical races. So I thought that was also pretty interesting.
Thank you for sharing. And I think that was an important point to note. Do any of you have any other additions to Olivia's comment?
Yeah, another interesting connection that Dr. Graves made in the article I read was about human variation. And he connected this back to Darwin and how Darwin first believed in evolution by natural selection. And he kind of touched on how that was a good foundation and that how now that the human variation comes about through evolution and how that's important to remember, and that even though we might be socially segregated into certain races, that it's really much more of a mixture.
Thank you. And I think mine also highlighted that too, is that the opposing for mine said that the claims of human racial differences result from natural selection for particular reproductive strategies from various racial groups. I think that is important to note that it can be skewed as a negative way, but also in your case, a positive way. So thank you for mentioning that. Ashley, did you have anything else to say?
Yeah, I think one thing that stood out to me that was also mentioned within the other articles was like the use of biological race. In the article that I read, he talked about how using the biological races containing different kinds of genomic code and genes can play major parts in solving major like diseases today within like different racial groups like strokes, heart disease. So the use of biological races can help create like different medicines or be used to find those base genes that can help contribute to, the health and like the evolution of medicine, which is an impactful thing that can be used within our century.
Yeah, thank you so much for mentioning that, Ashley. And I think it's important to diversify both biologically and socially. And thank you all for sharing. And I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.